You a mechanic? Don't make me laugh. You're not even cleared to touch SEAL tech. The Admiral's voice sliced through the hangar, drawing every eye to the woman in the oil-stained jumpsuit, tightening a bolt on the command console. She didn't answer, just entered a short code calm as a surgeon. The sonar display flickered, then spoke in a flat mechanical voice. Identity confirmed, call sign Iron Soul. Silence. The same man who just mocked her now staggered back eyes wide because only one person in the Navy had ever held that call sign, his former commanding officer, officially declared dead 11 years ago. Ilara Wincroft stood there, her hands steady, her face blank. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The weight of that moment pressed down on everyone in the hangar at Asterion Bay. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, strands sticking to her neck from sweat. Her jumpsuit was faded patched at the knees, and her boots were scuffed from years of climbing through engine rooms. Nobody would have guessed she was born into one of the wealthiest families in the country. Nobody would have thought she'd once led the most elite SEAL team in the Navy. To them, she was just the mechanic, the nobody, the woman who didn't belong. The Admiral's shock was a cheap parlor trick compared to the reaction of Fleet Commander Anya Sharma, positioned 10 feet to his left. Sharma, a woman whose reputation was built on mathematical precision and emotionless strategy, slowly lowered the heavy inspection clipboard she was holding. The sound of metal hitting the hangar floor echoed the flat announcement, "Identity confirmed, call sign Iron Soul." Sharma didn't scream or stumble. She simply stood, frozen, her usually unreadable eyes fixed on Ilara's oil-streaked profile. For 11 years, Sharma had carried the burden of closing the classified file on Operation Nightingale, the mission where Commander Wincroft was supposedly lost. Sharma had signed the death certificate believing the trauma of the loss had contributed to her own subsequent detachment. Now, the past was standing in a greasy jumpsuit tightening a bolt. The commander took a single deliberate step back, her disciplined posture crumbling not in fear of Ilara, but in the sudden gut-wrenching realization that she had mourned a ghost for over a decade. The sheer terrifying audacity of Ilara's survival and her decision to hide in plain sight as a base mechanic completely redefined the meaning of the word elite for everyone watching. The ceremony was supposed to be routine, a maintenance check on the Navy's newest submarine, a beast of a machine docked in the hangar. Ilara was there to sign off on the repairs. She'd been up since 4 a.m., crawling through the sub's guts, double-checking every valve, every wire. Her hands were black with grease, her nails chipped. She didn't care. She liked the work. It was honest. But the room was packed with SEALs officers and brass, all dressed in crisp uniforms, their medals glinting under the fluorescent lights. And there she was, in the middle of it, looking like she'd wandered in from a garage. The whispers started before she even stepped to the console. Admiral Kyle Strahan, all 6'4" of him, stood at the front, his chest puffed out, his voice booming like he owned the place. He was the kind of man who thought respect came with rank, not actions. His hair was silver, his jaw sharp, but his eyes had a mean glint like he was always looking for someone to put in their place. He spotted Ilara and smirked. "A mechanic fixing pipes thinks she can save the ocean," he said loud enough for the whole room to hear. A few officers chuckled. The insult about fixing pipes wasn't enough for Strahan. He had to solidify Ilara's low status with a tangible humiliation. He stepped deliberately on a worn leather-bound notebook Ilara had set near the console, her maintenance log detailing every idiosyncrasy of the $20 billion submarine. The heavy boot twisted the spine, grinding the leather into the hangar deck dust, and Strahan didn't even glance down. This was not about fixing pipes. This was about crushing the identity of the person holding the wrench. The entire audience watched, anticipating Ilara's explosion, but she only sighed softly, a sound of profound, exhausted patience. Without a word, she lowered herself onto her knees. In the oil slick, gently slid the damaged journal free from under the Admiral's foot and wiped the print off the cover with the sleeve of her filthy jumpsuit. The sheer self-effacing act of kneeling before the Admiral, while safeguarding her technical notes, spoke louder than any shout, projecting an unsettling calm that seemed to dare Strahan to push her further. Every officer there understood the message. She valued the integrity of her work, even the documentation, more than her own dignity, making the Admiral's aggressive pettiness look small and brutish by comparison. One nudged his buddy, pointing at her stained jumpsuit. Captain Darren Holt Strahan's shadow piped up next. He was short or wiry, with a fake smile that didn't reach his eyes. Always kissing up, always looking for a way to make the boss laugh. He leaned toward Strand, but his voice carried. If she was ever on the front lines, I bet she was just cooking for the real soldiers. The room erupted. A young lieutenant in the back clapped his hands, laughing so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. Another officer, a woman with a tight bun and a designer watch, rolled her eyes and muttered, "Why is she even here?" Alara's hands paused for a split second, just long enough to notice, then went back to work. It got worse when she dropped her wrench. It clattered on the deck, and a smear of oil splattered across Strand's polished dress shoes. The room went quiet, then exploded again. "Nice one, grease monkey." A burly SEAL called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He was the kind of guy who spent more time flexing in the mirror than training. Strand didn't laugh this time. He stepped closer, looming over her. "Women like you belong at home, not in a warrior's base," he said, his voice low and cold. Every head turned. Alara looked up, her gray eyes meeting his. She didn't flinch. "Is that an order, sir?" she asked, her voice soft, but steady. The room froze. Strand's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. The moment Alara defied Strand with her soft, steady voice, the atmosphere didn't just freeze, it cracked with calculated malice. Captain Holt, seeing his chance to earn favor, signaled discreetly to a nearby tech specialist with a minute, almost imperceptible twitch of his index finger. The young specialist, eager to please the brass, immediately accessed the sub's maintenance logs from a remote terminal and digitally inserted a false command, a temporary rollback of the sonar calibration Alara had just completed, designed to make the system report a critical error upon activation. This deliberate sabotage, intended to publicly invalidate her entire morning's labor, was a common, cruel tactic used to disgrace low-level technicians. Alara, still looking at the Admiral, didn't appear to notice the silent conspiracy, but her peripheral vision tracked the nervous shift in the specialist's stance. The complex, invisible betrayal that unfolded in that sterile air was far more dangerous than any shouted insult, ensuring that the system she was about to activate would expose her not as a hero, but as a technically fraudulent failure. She waited patiently for the inevitable digital trap to be sprung, the muscle in her jaw twitching almost imperceptibly as she prepared to face the engineered error. She turned back to her work. She wasn't always like this, quiet and visible. Years ago, she'd been different. A memory flickered, her standing on a dusty road in Yemen, her face streaked with dirt, her rifle slung across her back. She was yelling orders, her voice cutting through the chaos of gunfire. A younger Strand, bleeding from a gash in his leg, was slumped against a wall. She'd dragged him to cover, her hands steady even then. That was the last time she'd worn a SEAL uniform. After that mission, she'd disappeared. The Navy said she was dead. Her family said nothing, and she let the world believe it. Back in the hangar, the ceremony dragged on. Alara finished her checks and stepped back, wiping her hands on a rag. The sonar system hummed to life, and she typed in a code to test it. That's when it happened. The screen lit up, and that voice came through, identity confirmed, call sign Iron Soul. Strand's face went white. He stumbled back, his hand gripping the edge of a table. The room buzzed with confusion. A young officer, Commander Ryan Thaler, pushed through the crowd. He was lean and tense, with scars on his knuckles from years in the field. He stared at the screen, then at Alara. That's Iron Soul's code," he whispered. Alara didn't look at him. She just tapped 3 quick beats on the console, a signal only a SEAL would know. The system chirped back. Ryan's eyes widened. He'd trained under Iron Soul years ago, a mentor he'd never seen unmasked. She'd taught him how to move through shadows, how to survive when the odds were against you. He'd heard she died in a classified op. Now he was staring at a mechanic, her hands dirty, her face calm, and the pieces didn't fit. Strand recovered enough to bark, "This is a mistake. Get her out of here." But his voice shook. Alara picked up her wrench, slipped it into her bag, and walked out, her steps slow and deliberate. The room watched her go, some still snickering, others unsure. The second the hangar door hissed shut behind Alara, Commander Ryan Thaler stopped whispering and started moving. He bypassed the confused officers and headed straight for the console, not to erase evidence, but to secure it. Working with a desperate practiced efficiency honed by years of covert operations, Ryan didn't trust the base's recording system. He stripped a microport off the back panel of the main console and plugged in a military-grade encryption key he always carried. He wasn't just downloading the voice confirmation log, he was creating a physical, untraceable backup of the entire system diagnostic history, a record that would prove Alara had not only used the Iron Soul code, but had also successfully corrected the core structural flaw in the sonar unit that the Navy's entire team had missed. The adrenaline of the moment focused his mind, turning his shock into cold, hard loyalty. He knew that if the woman they called the mechanic truly was Iron Soul, the brass would try to bury her with a mountain of fabricated evidence. His actions taken in the immediate aftermath of the shock were a silent high-stakes declaration of war against the Admiral and anyone else who sought to discredit his former commander. Later that day in a sterile conference room, Strahan called an emergency meeting. The air was thick with tension. Officers sat around a long table, their faces tight. Alara stood at the far end, her jumpsuit out of place among the pressed uniforms. Strahan pointed at her, his voice sharp. "You triggered an unauthorized code. That's grounds for a court-martial." Holt, sitting to his right, leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. What if she's a spy? A mechanic wouldn't know SEAL codes. The accusation hung heavy. A few officers nodded, their faces hard. Ryan, sitting across the table, tried to speak. "Sir, that code, it's not something you fake." Strahan cut him off. A real SEAL wouldn't defend a lowlife tech. Alara stood there, her hands clasped behind her back. She didn't argue, didn't explain. Her eyes flicked to a photo on the wall, a grainy shot of a SEAL team in the desert, their faces blurred. She lingered on it for a moment, her jaw tightening. Then she spoke, her voice low. "Understood, Admiral. What's my next task?" Strahan smirked, thinking he'd won. "Clean the weapons locker, now." She nodded, picked up her bag, and left. The door clicked shut behind her, and the room felt colder. The moment the door closed behind Alara, leaving the stench of oil to mingle with the expensive cologne of the high brass, the conference room fractured. Strahan, basking in what he thought was a display of dominance, failed to notice the subtle, irreversible damage to his authority. A young lieutenant whose own father had served under Commander Wincroft openly coughed into his hand, a clear, audible signal of disgust. Captain Darren Holt, sensing the shift, leaned toward Strahan and whispered urgently, "Admiral, maybe we should have asked for an explanation first." Strahan dismissed him with a furious glare, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt planted by a woman in a dirty jumpsuit had taken root, splitting the room into silent factions, those who feared Strahan's rank and those who now feared the truth. The tension was so thick that when Commander Sharma, the highest-ranking officer present after Strahan, rose without a word and pointedly adjusted the security settings on her tablet, it signaled the beginning of a quiet mutiny, forcing every other officer to choose between self-preservation and the chilling implications of the resurrected Iron Soul. In the weapons locker, Alara worked alone, stacking crates, wiping down equipment. The air smelled of metal and oil. She moved with precision, her hands quick but careful. A faint hum caught her attention, a radio in the corner, crackling with static. It was an old model, the kind she'd used in the field. She paused, her fingers brushing the dials. A voice came through, faint but clear Iron Soul report. She froze. Her hand hovered, then turned the knob off. She didn't need to answer. Not yet. Ilara's fingers, stained dark with gun oil, left a slight shimmer on the radio knob as she killed the transmission from the overseas contact. The voice was unmistakable, her former handler, a signal she was supposed to answer instantly, regardless of her location or immediate peril. Her refusal wasn't an act of cowardice, but a fierce, protective commitment to the 11 years of anonymity she had carved out for herself. She moved away from the radio, her body language still deceptively placid, but her eyes were scanning the dusty metal-lined space with the focused intensity of a predator. Beneath a shelf stacked with thermal optics, she noticed a faint, almost microscopic scratch on the concrete floor, a displacement that didn't match the heavy equipment. She knelt, slowly pulled a thin utility knife from her boot heel, and meticulously scraped away a small patch of grime, revealing a minute, nearly invisible metallic mesh smaller than her thumbnail. It was a listening device, non-military issue designed for deep surveillance evidence that her private life as a mechanic had been compromised not just by Navy politics, but by the same hostile intelligence agency that had orchestrated her death. Her silence had protected her identity. Now this discovery confirmed she was running out of time. Meanwhile, Major Kira Voss sat in a dimly lit office across the base. She was sharp all angles with a stare that could cut glass. She'd known Alara since their training days, back when they were both green and fearless. Kira was the only one who knew the truth. Alara hadn't died. She'd gone dark, hidden by the Navy, to protect her after a mission went sideways. Kira's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up a classified file. She hesitated, then hit send. The file landed in the command room system, marked Operation Sable Ghost. Back in the conference room, the screen flickered. Strawn was mid-rant when the file opened. A photo loaded Alara younger in full SEAL gear, her face half hidden by a helmet. The text read, Commander Alara Wincroft, call sign, Iron Soul, status, presumed dead. Ryan stood up his chair, scraping the floor. That's her, he said, his voice breaking. She was my commander. Strawn's face drained of color. He stared at the screen, his hands shaking. Holt laughed nervously. Come on, it's fake. A mechanic. But nobody else laughed. The room was silent. Strawn doubled down. He stormed out, barking orders to security. Arrest her. She's tampered with classified systems. 2 guards grabbed Alara as she left the locker, their grips tight on her arms. The base was buzzing now, whispers spreading like wildfire. She's a fraud one, Sailor said, shaking his head. A mechanic pretending to be a SEAL. Pathetic, another muttered. Holt was in the crowd smirking. Bet she bought that code off some dark web hacker. Alara didn't react. She walked between the guards, her head high, her steps even. When they reached the courtyard, Strahan was waiting. I'll make sure the world knows you're a liar, he said, his voice loud enough for the gathering crowd. Then the alarm screamed. Red lights flashed across the base. A voice crackled over the intercom. Intruder alert. Hostile vessels at Asterian port. Chaos erupted. Strawn shouted orders, but the defense system wouldn't respond. Officers scrambled screens, blinking error codes. Alara stopped, her voice cutting through the noise. You locked the wrong protocol. Let me fix it. Strahan laughed bitter. You save us. But Ryan stepped forward. Let her try. She didn't wait for permission. She walked to the nearest console, her fingers flying over the keys. The screen lit up. Commander Alara Wincroft. SEAL 9 clearance. The defense grid roared to life, cannons locking onto the enemy ships. The attack was over, in minutes. The base was quiet again, but the air had changed. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing. Strawn stood in front of them, his voice smooth. A minor glitch handled by my team. Holt nodded, all smiles. The Admiral had it under control, but the sailors weren't buying it. One of them, a kid barely out of training, pointed at Alara. She did it, not him. Alara didn't acknowledge the praise. She was already walking away, her bag slung over her shoulder. Holt ran after her, his voice low. Look, we were just following orders. She didn't stop. Her eyes were cold like steel left out in the rain. While Strawn was smoothly lying to the cameras about a minor glitch, his chief of staff was racing to the command center with a new explicit order: scrub the entire defense system's activation log, specifically the part showing the Commander Alara Wincroft, SEAL 9, clearance bypass. However, Ryan Thaylor's unauthorized key backup and the system's inherent deeper redundancy protocols prevented a clean deletion. Frustrated and cornered by the unerasable evidence of his failure, Strahan pivoted his attack. He filed an immediate official charge against Alara, not for tampering with the system, but for the far more ambiguous and difficult-to-defend crime of unauthorized possession of government property, referring to the simple high-frequency diagnostic tool she carried in her personal toolbox, a tool she had custom-built and which had been officially decommissioned decades ago. The Admiral's accusation was a poisonous red herring, turning a momentary act of heroism into a protracted, tedious legal battle designed to drag her through the mud of bureaucracy and permanently invalidate her testimony. The document, stamped with "Priority Classified," landed on a DOS desk minutes later, ensuring that even after saving the base, Alara's fight was only just beginning. Days later, the Department of Defense called a hearing. The room was packed, officers, reporters, even the president's staff. A screen flickered on, showing grainy footage from Yemen 12 years back. A SEAL team under fire, pinned down. Strahan, younger, bleeding out. A figure in tactical gear dragged him to safety, her movements precise, fearless. The camera caught her face for a split second, Alara. The room gasped. Ryan's voice broke the silence. She saved us. All of us. Strahan sat there, his hands gripping the table, his face gray. The hearing shifted everything. Strahan tried to spin it, telling anyone who'd listen that Alara was just riding sympathy to climb the ranks. A few old officers backed him, muttering about exaggerated legends. Holt took it further, posting on the base's internal network, calling her a fraud who'd hacked her way into glory. The comments piled up, some defending her, others tearing her down. Alara didn't respond. She didn't need to. She was back in the hangar working on a new sub, her hands steady as ever. But the whispers followed her. A sailor dropped a photo by her toolbox, an old shot of her in uniform, her face unmistakable. She picked it up, stared at it, then tucked it away. Hours before the medal ceremony, Alara stood in the maintenance bay, adjusting the sleeves of her old dress uniform. The bay was quiet, save for the rhythmic clang of metal from the far side. 3 junior enlisted technicians, the same ones who had nervously laughed at Holt's cooking joke, weeks prior, approached her. They didn't speak. They simply stood at attention, their faces etched with a profound, newfound respect. The leader of the group, a young man named Jackson, stepped forward and silently placed something on the edge of her toolbox. A small, intricately machined metal disc, polished to a mirror, shine with the hand-etched image of a single wrench crossing a stylized trident. It was a piece of shrapnel they had painstakingly removed from the hull during the cleanup. After the attack, she thwarted a tangible reminder of the chaos she had prevented, and a mechanic's gift of profound gratitude. The silent offering was a far more genuine and powerful confirmation of her status than any medal the president could bestow, marking her acceptance not by the hierarchy, but by the soldiers whose lives she had directly saved. She paused, picked up the cool medal in her hand, and nodded once, a gesture of mutual respect that acknowledged the true source of her loyalty and strength. The final moment came at the medal ceremony. The base was packed, the air heavy with anticipation. The president stepped to the podium, his voice calm but firm. "Today, we honor Iron Soul." Alara walked out not in her jumpsuit, but in a crisp navy uniform, her medals gleaming. The crowd stood there, applause deafening. Ryan was there holding the unit's insignia. "My orders, Admiral," he said, his voice thick. Strahan stood at the edge, his face crumpled. He unpinned his own medal, walked to her, and placed it in her hand. His voice was barely a whisper. "I owe you my life." She didn't smile, she just nodded. The ceremony ended with a chant. "Iron Soul, ma'am." It echoed across the base, a wave of respect that drowned out the past. Strahan was quietly reassigned, his career over. Holt's post was traced, and he was discharged for misconduct. The officers who'd mocked her found their names trending online, their sponsors pulling out. Alara didn't watch it unfold. She was already back at work, her hands in the gears, her focus unbreakable. She'd been counted out, laughed at, dismissed, but she'd stood her ground, not with words, not with anger, just with truth. She didn't need to shout. The world had seen her. And for anyone who'd ever been looked down on, who'd felt the sting of being called, her silence said it all. You're enough. You always were. The fight isn't loud. It's steady. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.